Hey, everyone's got their coffee, everyone's well fed, and we will get started on our afternoon session. Welcome back.
I am Yvonne Hirsch, counsel to the Joint State Government Commission, and I'm going to go back on the agenda now. I'm also I just assume everybody knows who I am. Anyway, so we're going to talk about primary issues. This is something I know Lisa had asked me about, and I think we're probably going to have some interesting conversation about this. I know one of the concerns Lisa expressed is that any changes need lots and lots and lots of lead-in time for the counties to prepare for it, and that it may already be kind of late for next spring. But we have a couple of things going on right now. There is always interest every presidential election cycle to move Pennsylvania's presidential primary back further. I think that's right, going back on the calendar, so that we're more in the vanguard and we're not voting for electors and presidential candidates after half the country has already voted and people have more or less been eliminated and things like that. So we have that issue of people wanting to be more relevant in the primary season. And there are bills introduced right now. One, I think, goes back to the third Tuesday of March. The other is the first Tuesday of April, I believe. And they are general amendments to the election law that would permanently move those dates for presidential primary years. So that's one aspect of the issue. The other aspect of the issue is that there is legislation to move the primary election date for 2024 only and move it back. And at least one of the justifications that I have heard for this proposition is because current primary election day falls on Yom Kippur? Passover. Okay. I'm sorry. I don't know a lot of faith holidays outside of the Lutheran Church. Anyway, so for Passover. And I see a couple issues with that. If you look at the statute, we moved it once before during COVID. We pushed it back till June. The pandemic seems like a good reason to change a date for an election. Moving the date because it falls on a religious holiday seems to me to be a little potentially problematic, in that there are other religious holidays in March and April in the Islamic calendar, in the Hindu calendar. Did a little research on this whole thing. I can't believe I couldn't remember Passover. I know Yom Kippur's in September, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway, where'd my brain go? So I did a little research on that. And I'm a little concerned that there could be accusations of favoritism to one particular faith body by moving that date. I looked, everything I could find, because I was thinking, if you wanted to do something more permanent or fair, you could say, any faith holiday that falls on the scheduled primary that's part of a faith that's 10% or more of the populace or something like that. But when you look at Pennsylvania, outside of Christian faiths, everybody else is at 1% or less. So then I wonder, are you going to have someone complaining that there's a holiday where work is restricted in my faith and it falls on an election day and you're not changing it, but you're doing it for this particular holiday? So that's the twist on that one I see. And of course, then there's all the pragmatic implementation. How do you make this happen kind of issues? So for what it's worth, let's talk about that primary date first. Russ.
Thank you, Yvonne. You covered the two major topics. I mean, these are the two major arguments. First of all, folks want to be more relevant in the primary election process when casting a vote for president. We hear that argument every 4 years. It's an old argument. And look, I would love for Pennsylvania to be the only state that's that picks the presidential candidates. That said, this year, I don't know that there's going to be a whole lot of choices by the time it gets to Pennsylvania, no matter when Pennsylvania is. So that argument is an old one, and I think it's one that we can dispatch with relatively easily. The second argument, that primary election day falls on the beginning of Passover, when certain very Orthodox members of the Jewish faith aren't permitted to drive. I certainly understand the concern there, but this is the exact reason why we passed no excuse mail-in voting in Pennsylvania. And according to all sources official, it is safe, it is secure, and it can be used. We have that option for those observant members of the Jewish faith to cast their ballot. And I'm not seeing why we should make this particular exception because of the very reasons you stated. Sometime there's going to be another religion that has a holiday that coincides with an election day, and then we're going to have an uproar because we're not moving it because that religion is too quote unquote minor. With those two main arguments in favor of advancing the primary, in my mind, at least dispatched, I am far more concerned with the impact this is going to have on our counties and our boards of elections. I spoke with our election director in Lebanon County. He immediately raised two concerns. Number one, they already have contracted polling places. They may need to find alternate polling places in some of these places. That's very short notice for them. Number two, poll workers. Many of them are older. Many of them winter in Florida or down south or wherever, and this may create a shortage of poll workers. And we already know on this board that we have an issue in Pennsylvania with having sufficient number of people to actually work on election day. Beyond that, my director of elections told me there are many other things that they schedule well months, if not years in advance, such as logic and accuracy testing of the machines they use, and down the line and down the line and down the line. And it all comes down to personnel shuffling. When we moved the primary during COVID, we made it later. That gave them more breathing room. The efforts before the General Assembly now are to move the primary election faster, or to make it appear sooner on the calendar, which compresses the calendar for our counties. And in layman's terms, it's like this. The counties and the election workers don't just show up on election day to run the election. They've been doing things for months, if not years in advance to plan for this. Secretary of State or Secretary of the Commonwealth Schmidt, I believe it was maybe 5-6 weeks ago, did raise the alarm bell and says, look, it's getting to be too late to do this. And I agree with him 100%. Again, I don't want to stress out our election directors or our election workers any more than we've already done over the past few years. We've lost far too many of them, and we need to retain as many of them as possible. And I don't want to put any more pressure. Beyond those arguments, then I want to talk about candidates who are going to appear on the ballot. If you move the primary election date to March 19th, and the Department of State sticks with the current election calendar, that means that candidates who want to appear on the ballot will need to start gathering signatures on December 19th, requiring them to go out and knock on doors over the holiday season, where it's a little difficult to find people at home. Look, I'm a 5-term legislator, and as an incumbent, I have the wherewithal to figure out how to do this. But somebody who wants to challenge me and get on the ballot may not have that same advantage. I do believe that moving the primary forward is an indirect incumbent protection plan and is unfair to anybody else who's not an incumbent who wants to run for office. The calendar has been set. The election workers have been going on that. And at this late date, I think I just think it's too late to change this primary election. Look, I think there is an argument to say that Pennsylvania might want to have more say in a presidential election. But are we really going to sacrifice all the other issues that are associated with moving a primary? The compression of the election calendar, the inconvenience and maybe advantage that it gives to incumbents by having to gather signatures over a holiday season? Are we really going to do that for all those other races, which are many, many more? Look, my old philosophy has always been this. I know a lot of people think the presidential election is the most important election that we ever do, but I guarantee you it's far more important who your school board member is, who your township supervisors are. Look, that doesn't coincide with the presidential election, but the lower races on the ballot are probably far more important to your everyday life than who is the president of the United States. I know we get all uptight about who the president of the United States is, but when it comes to the importance of election battles, the ones on the lower ballot are more important to your everyday life. So are we going to inconvenience all those other races and create all this chaos just so Pennsylvania is going to have an early presidential primary? And if so, the year for changing that date, the time for changing that date is not 6 months before that's supposed to happen. It's years in advance so that the Department of State and our county election boards can have plenty of time to get all their ducks in a row before that happens. That's my rant, and I'll just leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Lisa.
Thank you. And I echo Ross's sentiment. It is absolutely too late. Just like, for example, the school calendars have already been set. So schools are already scheduled to be off on election day, our public schools in Philadelphia. So now we're going to change the date. And I don't know what impact that is going to have on our polling locations. Unfortunately, although I do agree, and my number one priority and my number one choice is to keep it exactly where it is, I do hear pretty strongly, as I'm sure you do, is that they're determined to change it. And because of that, I think it's important because the legislature created this election law advisory board in Act 77, and yet they have not enacted one of our recommendations. And I cannot believe that they would do something as drastic as changing an election date without at least considering what we have to say on the matter, or at least listen to anything. So I think it's important that we say something and that we are at least heard. I agree with the President pro tempore in what she said about our elections. First, Pennsylvania is very important on the national stage, and our primary should reflect that, though I disagree that it should come at the expense of our election workers. Second, that due to Act 77, people are now waiting on votes to be counted to find out who won the presidency. And lastly, that counties and election workers have really taken it on the chin for the last few years with court rulings and action out of the legislature. Yet somehow they've managed to succeed despite the obstacles put in front of them. Things always work out well until they don't. What I propose is that we recommend and address all three of those concerns. I would propose that if the presidential primary were to move to March 19th, that be a fixed date for future primaries so that it is not a one-off. We will always have an increased voice in the presidential nomination process, and everyone will have a fixed date so it can be planned around. We should not change the petition schedule. I got 10,000 signatures the first time I ran for city commissioner. It snowed most of the time for those signatures. I had people on the L, on the subway, and on the train getting signatures. Now, I recognize it's a lot easier in Philadelphia because of the population, but I also worked in the state house for 10 years for a state representative. And to your point, if you can't get 300 or 500 signatures in 3 weeks, regardless of a holiday, then you should maybe reconsider running for election. Finally, in June of 2021, this body proposed an optional 14 days of pre-canvassing of mail ballots. This should finally be acted on, as this would provide much earlier clarity for the outcome of our presidential election, and the fact that it hasn't been enacted is really a failing in the spirit of the legislation. I heard a report from the staff that pre-canvassing was covered in Act 12. To be clear, Act 12 made it so that election officials are not allowed to sleep. What we proposed in 2021 would make it easier on election officials while delivering better services to our constituents. Furthermore, regardless if the calendar is 13 weeks or 11 weeks, election workers are going to have to roll right from the November election through December and the holidays to the primary. So if you're going to make their lives miserable at the front end, we should hopefully make it easier on the back end. So I would say that it's important that each of us or this board come together and have some kind of statement on this changing of the election date. And hopefully the legislature will hear us, since they are the ones that created this board. Thank you.
I think the fact that we're sitting here on September 22nd and we don't know when the primary election for 2024 will be is absurd. It's absolutely absurd. And I agree with much of what Representative Diamond said. I'm glad you're here because I feel that so many of your colleagues, so many of our state representatives and state senators just don't understand what it actually takes to run an election. And I heard people say, oh, we still have plenty of time, but they don't know that we have to lease polling locations. They don't know that we have to recruit polling workers. What will happen no matter what, and I believe in Monco, it's going to be like it was in 2020. We'll have fewer polling locations. We'll have to combine polling locations because we won't have enough locations and we won't have enough workers. That's going to be an added expense then of letting people know that their polling location changed. People hate when their polling location changes and it's going to change back. But, I get frustrated. I actually saw Titanic last week for the 100th time. And it feels like the band that's playing and everyone's getting off the ship and they say, well, let's just play on. I feel that that's what the General Assembly does to our counties when it comes to the election. So I have absolutely no faith. I believe it's going to move. I just wish move it and give us a date and let us start to prepare. But understand, don't come complaining then when your constituents say my polling location moved or I'm in a high school, because it's just not going to happen. So I'm concerned with right now and what's going to happen in 2024. The greater issues of moving it, that's fine. If we could be earlier, fine. But I just want to say again that it's absolutely absurd that it is September 22nd. And election officials do not know the primary date for the spring 2024 election.
Jesse?
Is there anyone here who's for moving it? Because I've been here long enough to know that normally Lisa and Russ are on different sides of issues. And the fact that they're on the same side tells
It's a
me
kumbaya moment.
this might be one of those rare moments when we're all on the same page. And if so, perhaps we could clearly show that by not having a single person advocate for moving it. I think that sends a message and allows us to move on to things where perhaps we do have some disagreements we could talk through.
Well, if I can just clarify, we have two members of the board here, or two people here at the board meeting who represent members of the Senate who have already voted on a bill here. I would not want to put them in a position of having to out themselves as disagreeing with their boss. I don't know how any of the senators voted on it, but I would not want to put that a staff member in that kind of position. But with that said, would it be in order, Mr. Chairman, to offer a motion that this board publicly announce that it does not support moving the primary election?
I'm sitting here thinking, first of all, I want to let Nathan speak, but I'm sitting here thinking we could, and I don't think there's anything that prevents us from doing that, is compose a letter to leadership that says, here's what we think, and here are the reasons. Obviously, we would draft it, we would send it out to everybody, we'd have a deadline for responses and agreement on it, but then we would be able to express on behalf of the board that these were the concerns, and this is why the board doesn't think it should be moved. Nathan.
Yeah, just wanted to provide a little bit more information. So for everybody's reference, the Senate did pass it 45-2. My boss was one of the yes votes. His boss, though, was one of the no votes. So I'm sure he can elaborate on that too. But one of the things I know my boss considered in placing yes vote was also going back to the Passover argument. A lot of Jewish community centers or synagogues serve as polling locations too. That was one of the things that swayed us. I just wanted to add a little bit more flesh to that argument. Definitely understand that, other religious holidays that, we shouldn't be placing precedence of one over another, and definitely understand the county's concerns and election workers' concerns, but just wanted to add a little bit more context there. Yeah, I don't know. I'm in.
So, yeah, my boss was one of two senators who voted against it. A lot of it for the reasons that Representative Diamond had brought up. He has serious concerns around the ability of polling locations to be found, what it's going to do in terms of the election calendar, how counties are going to manage petition challenges, whether or not, there's a whole host of complex issues that are going to go into this. And to the chairman's point, it is now the end of September, and from what I read in media accounts, the House doesn't appear that they're going to take up the measure until October 2nd in the state government committee. So we had an entire year to work on this, and it's just kind of now being worked on, and that is, from Senator Coleman's perspective, was incredibly disappointing and concerning.
So you want me to write a letter?
I would say that since we are a board, I think a motion is in order. And I would also say that we do have, that is an accurate point. We do have a lot of Jewish community centers and synagogues that do provide polling space.
So before the motion is made, I have a question. I don't know that we've dealt with this before, and this is no offense to Leo and Nathan. I just don't know the answer. But do we even have a mechanism on this board to have a proxy vote? I'm not sure. Not that I'm forcing you guys to vote. I'm just not sure if what we did there.
Yeah, I think you could do this, do the motion, and then we would circulate the letter, and then we would get feedback from the people who aren't here, so that the responses would all come via email and everybody would have an opportunity to weigh in. And then if we got responses that said that were predominantly, no, this should be happening, then we'd have to reconsider what we were doing. But I think initially, Steve says we don't need a second. If we just had the motion, we could go back, we could draft and try to turn this around quickly to get it out before the committee meeting.
I'm comfortable abstaining as a proxy. I think that would be best, probably.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm same boat. Happy to abstain.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to be clear on my second point about the community centers and the synagogues. So I've been involved in the conduct of elections probably since I was 18, and unfortunately, the primary election has often fallen within the Passover holiday. So we do have polling locations and community centers that are, Jewish community centers or synagogues. We've been able to adapt to that. But moving, I think it's going to be a bigger hurdle for us if our public schools are not scheduled to be closed on election day as they typically are, because they didn't know that we were going to move the holiday. We have a lot of polling in public schools.
And I know that's a concern where I live about safety and security for the kids. If you're trying to hold the election while the kids are in school, that's a real concern with
And
parents.
to Lisa's point, you've had time to plan ahead for that, knowing when the date is going to be. And number two, more importantly, the issue of poll workers is a very real concern. I mean, it's hard enough to get enough people to staff those polls every time, even when we know when the date is going to be. If we try and move it, I mean, you have to realize, at least in rural Pennsylvania, and I think most everywhere, the average age of a poll worker is probably 75, and their schedules are set long in advance most of the time. And as Russ said, many of them are vacationing or down south through the winter months. It is going to make it nearly impossible.
Or of doctor's appointments as I approach that demographic.
So I think it's a two-pronged thing though for some legislators from what I hear. There's the Passover holiday, but then there's the desire to move it up earlier for the presidential election so we can be a player within the presidential election. What I would say, whatever it's going to be, and I defer to the legislature and your powers to do that. But you have to give us time. There has to be some mechanism for future things that there has to be an understanding that there needs to be time given for the counties to plan for the election. So whatever we do, we need to put in, you can't be doing this.
Yes, that's why I was just thinking in what we draft, when we talk about potentially moving it to make Pennsylvania more relevant, that any move has to have like an effective date of a year or something like, but that there's enough, any change has to have enough time for the counties to respond to it. And I think that would be appropriate to include, as well as you can't make it effective upon passage. You can't make it effective in 6 months. You have to have a lead-in time that's sufficient for the counties. But that's certainly something. And
If I can just add one more piece of color commentary on the presidential primary. The presidential primary in Pennsylvania is not binding upon the members of the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee when they actually nominate the person who is going to be their party's person who is running for president. It is not binding.
yeah, we kind of, if you didn't know it before, you learned it in 2020. So, yeah, that is also a point.
So then I guess my motion, if I'm going to make a motion, is that the board staff draft a letter illustrating concerns brought up today. Send it around for commentary, addition, that sort of thing, but doing it with enough alacrity that members of the General Assembly can at least have time to review it before those October 2nd scheduled hearings in the House State Government Committee. That would be my motion.
Second.
Okay. I'll wave my magic wand and I'll make it happen. Steve's not here. I'm not going to let him write that anyway. I'm going to write that. Huh? I have to write the motion? Oh, Steve. Oh, we have to vote on the motion. I don't like this procedural stuff.
Welcome to my world.
I just want to talk and everybody says, yeah, okay, let's go. That makes me happiest. Anyway, so I guess you want to call a vote on the motion? Mr. Chairman?
It's been moved by Representative Diamond and seconded by Commissioner Deely. All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? Motion carries.
Consensus.
Oh, abstentions, two
And two
abstentions,
abstentions, yes.
And it's,
I abstained as well.
3 abstentions.
thank you very much, everybody. I'm a little bit surprised that my arguments were the arguments of, or the feelings of everybody as well. But I will tell you that as a member of the legislature who will likely be voting on this on the floor, I will make the same arguments there that I've made here, because those are the real arguments. So thank you so much, folks, for your participation.
We like you to win one every now and again, Russ.
Sometimes I'm the only one making the smart arguments. Most of the times I'm the only one making. No, I'm kidding.
Ah, yes. You have lived up to my expectations, Russ. Yes, you are delightful. And I'm charming. So, I mean, we're perfect. Okay. The next thing we have on our agenda, and we've talked about briefly, it was an issue that the original board thought we needed to explore, and that is the concept of open primaries. And I asked Stephen to do a little background to talk about initially what an open primary means, because it can be different things depending on, like, your checklist. Is it open if you're an R, a D, and an independent? Or is it open to every affiliation? Is it open to unaffiliated people? So anyway, having babbled that, Steve, you want to talk? I'll give you the microphone.
Yeah, do you want me to talk about all the different primary types or just the open primary types? Because there's a couple.
I would start. Yeah, I have no idea. Do what you want.
Okay. That's it. Okay. In preparation for this meeting, Yvonne asked me to kind of look into the different types of primaries that the states utilize, and just kind of give just real general information about, the difference between each of them. And so I figured I would just start with Pennsylvania. I mean, as you all know, we have a closed primary, which means that in order to participate in the primary, you have to be a registered party member voter of that party of the primary that you're voting in. Essentially, the closed primary excludes independent and unaffiliated voters who don't affiliate with a particular party. And
Only your party owned.
correct. But again, there's some variations here between a closed and an open primary. It's not just open and closed. There's also what's called partially closed. And that's basically where the state law allows political parties to determine whether or not they want to allow unaffiliated voters to participate in their primary or not. Some people are for this. They think it it adds more flexibility. Although part of the problems with this that some people highlight is that it creates some uncertainty as to who can, in a given election cycle, who can participate in the primaries. And then going to an open primary, that's where any voter can vote in any primary. They don't have to, typically, from what I understand, typically during the voter registration application process, they don't have to designate a party that they affiliate. So this is kind of the maximum flexibility. This is the maximum option for flexibility. But some people argue that this could dilute a party's ability to nominate its candidate. Then we have partially open primaries, which is where in a partially open primary, voters from different party lines can cross party lines and vote in a different party's primary. But they still, I believe they still exclude independents and voters who are unaffiliated with a particular party. So then another primary option that some states utilize is known as a open to unaffiliated voters primary. And that's where voters who don't align with a party or aren't affiliated with a party can partake in a particular party's primary. However, under this system, parties can't, voters who are affiliated with a party can't, vote cross party lines. They can't switch over to the other party's primary. And then there's a number of states that do that. The most common between the ones that I just listed is the open primary. I think 15 or 16 states in the US actually have primary or open primaries. Then there's another kind that I looked up and did a little bit of research on. It was, it's primary system that's utilized in California and Washington. It's commonly referred to as like a top two selection primary system, which is where a common ballot is used for all of the candidates. They're all on the same ballot. And essentially the top two vote getters end up being the nominees for the general election to be voted on. And then there's some other variations of that system. I know Alaska has like a top four system where they, in the primary, they nominate top four candidates all on a common ballot. And then the general election is to pick between those four candidates. Just to go through that list though, again, some of the common, I've seen lists of pros and cons for each of them. Again, closed primaries, proponents of it argue that it prevents dilution of a party's ability to nominate, and it contributes to strong party organization. However, some argue that it excludes and disenfranchises independents and unaffiliated voters. Partially closed primaries, they're a little bit more flexible, but they have that uncertainty aspect to them, depending on what the party wants to do. Open primaries, they're more inclusive option. They're most common among the states. I think there's not a clear majority, but more states than the other category. Most of the states are fall in that category. But some people argue that that can dilute the party's ability to nominate. And then there's partially open. That's a middle ground between the closed and the open primaries. Open to unaffiliated voters, again, another middle ground. It's inclusive of independent and affiliated voters, but it does not allow cross-party voting. And then the top two option that California and Washington uses, it can increase the likelihood of moderates advancing to general election. That's what I've seen as one of the some proponents saying. However, it reduces voter choice by making it possible that two candidates from the same party can face off in the general election. So not everybody is in favor of that system either. So those are the differences between that spectrum of primaries. And from what I could see, and I'd have to just confirm this to make sure that they're completely updated, but it looks like there's at least 7 states in the United States have closed primaries, including Pennsylvania. About 9 have partially closed. 16, which is the most common, is open. 16 states have open primaries. 6 states have partially open. 7 states have open to unaffiliated voters. And there's about 4 or 5 more states that have either the top 2 or miscellaneous other variations of the top 2 primary system.
So let's talk about open primaries. Yes.
I actually have thought a lot about this for a very, very long time, to tell you the truth. Look, in full disclosure, before I was a Republican, I was an adult independent voter, and I wasn't able to vote in the primaries. But I understood that Pennsylvania had a closed primary system. And look, you have to actually first think about why we have primary elections to begin with. We have primary elections to begin with. They were brought to Pennsylvania to bring out of the smoke-filled rooms the process of nominating candidates, to make that process more transparent and more subject to the will of the voters. And with that in mind, then you have to see, okay, what are Pennsylvania's primaries like now, and what happens if we just say, okay, independents can vote in primaries? Okay, so how does that actually work? Can an independent show up on election day and say, today I want to be a Republican, or today I want to be a Democrat? If that's what we're going for, how is that fair to any Democrat or Republican who shows up on election day and wouldn't be allowed to say, today I want to be a Democrat instead of a Republican? So there's an inequity that would happen if we would just say, well, they can show up and vote in primary elections. The other concern that we have in Pennsylvania is that in even numbered years, the local Republican and Democrat party committees and the state Democrat and Republican party committees hold their elections for committee members. And those are final elections. They're not primary elections. They are final elections. Are you going to also allow independent voters to vote in a Republican Party committee election or a Democratic Party committee election? I would say it would be unfair. And as a Republican and as a member of my county committee, as a member of my state committee, I don't want independents determining who's going to sit on my committees. If you're not going to allow them to vote in those elections, which are held on primary days in even number of years, but you're going to allow them to vote for candidates in the Republican Democratic Party on primary election days, now you have a different problem. And this goes back to my other concern about our counties. In Lebanon County, we have 60 precincts. Every primary election, our Board of Elections is required to produce 120 unique ballots to cover all the precincts in the world. If now you're going to allow independents to vote for candidates, but not for those primary election coincident committee elections, now you're going to have to produce twice as many ballots. You're going to have to produce a ballot for a Republican voter, a ballot for a Democrat voter, a ballot for an independent who wants to vote in the Democrat primary, and another ballot for a person who wants to vote, who is an independent who wants to vote in a Democrat, or you get what I mean? Twice as many ballots. What does that mean? That means twice as much proofreading, twice as much. And in a small county like ours, we print our ballots ahead of time in 2 languages. That's twice as much proofreading and twice as much opportunity for those mistakes, which we see election after election after election, which are simple human errors. Nobody's causing them on purpose, but we see that. Lancaster County, I believe, sent out over 10,000 ballots that were in error, not because there was a language problem, not because there was a candidate problem, but because in one race they said, vote for 1 when you could really vote for 2. It's those small problems that we're going to try and look. This all adds up to more chaos for our county elections boards. And you know what, on that issue of whether independents should vote in those election contests, which are for party committee seats, not public office, party committee seats, in a state house government or house state government committee hearing we had on this in Delaware County, I believe it was now close to 2 years ago. We had a former state party chairman and a former Democrat state party chairman testify in favor of letting independents vote in primaries. And I asked them, should we be allowing those independent candidates to also vote in those party committee elections, which are held on the primary election. Their answer was they hadn't even thought about that. So we, as we're trying to go down this road, we have to think about that. Do we really want to complicate that election ballot production system, which already every election we hear about mistakes being made, human errors, that sort of thing. So I think, look, I get the argument. These folks help pay for the primary elections, so maybe they should be able to participate. But unless we consider all the factors that are involved here, we're going to sell ourselves short. There are other factors being involved. How would that impact a Democrat or a presidential primary? Are there rules from the Republican National Committee or the Democratic National Committee that might impact that? Are we going to let independents vote in some candidate elections, but not committee elections? That question has to be answered. And why then wouldn't we also allow an independent candidate to run in the primary? If we're going to let independents participate in the primaries, let's let independents run in the primaries. Why not just open it all up? And that goes to the top two system that California and Washington State use. It's also called a jungle primary where anybody can get in, and and the top two move on to the general. I think there's room to discuss all of these things, but we have to discuss everything that's involved. Here's the reality. Every voter in Pennsylvania can already qualify to vote in a primary election, regardless of their party affiliation. Why? Because party affiliation is not a permanent fixture. You can change it as late as 15 days before any given election. It's free. We don't charge a dime to do it. And you can do it as many times as you like. That's the summation of where we are in Pennsylvania. But let's be careful about what we're asking for to allow independents to participate in primaries. I think a lot of people make the mistake of saying that their voter registration noted political affiliation is as important to them as their religion, or maybe even their gender. But in Pennsylvania, you can change that political affiliation that you're registered under as many times as possible. Well, the other question we want to ask is, if I'm an independent and I show up to vote in the primary, well, why couldn't I pick the vote for the Republican in this race, but a Democrat in this race? Now you're talking a whole lot more confusion when it comes to pre-printing ballots that the counties have to do. So there's a lot of issues here. Just letting independents to show up and declare themselves to be a member of one party or another, it's not gonna work in Pennsylvania, because now you're allowing them to have a say in internal party affairs, which, by the way, those party committee elections and the primary elections themselves were all invented to bring those selection processes out of the smoke-filled rooms, from behind closed doors, so that the will of the voters has more say and more influence in that, rather than party bosses sitting behind, the smoke-filled rooms and just, I want this person to run, chomping on cigars. So we have to realize where we got this primary process from, why we made it the way it is, what it is, and what are the ramifications if we let independents or non-affiliated voters participate. And, we just have to look at the whole picture before we go changing our minds on how we do it in Pennsylvania. Thanks.
Well, I think one of the things I think, and it may be more of an education thing, is that people don't necessarily understand what the primary is for. That they hear an election and I'm being excluded from an election. but it's one party picking their candidates. And I think that is not being communicated to people very well, that there's a reason why only Democrats vote in the Democratic primary, because they're picking their party's candidates. And I think people don't see that. They just see I'm being excluded from an election. So I think it's an educational component to it. And back to something else you were saying, we already have counties who run out of ballots because they can't predict how many ballots they're going to need. So if you have even more options, how many more places are going to run out of ballots? And some of those places, I'm like, this has happened a few times. Maybe we should be reconsidering the number of ballots we print. When, it's one thing to have it happen once in your county. It's another to have it happen repeatedly. But that's another soapbox I can get on. Christina.
So I was going to ask for Stephen and Yvonne to do some homework if possible. And that is, I'd like to know how many states have open primaries, but do not have any Democratic or Republican committee elections locally. And I think that if we could take a look at that and see if possibly, and I know, Russ, you're not a fan of going back to those smoke-filled rooms, and I love the way you say smoke-filled rooms, by the way, but as you said earlier, even the smoke-filled, you're still from a federal perspective, the presidential election is still being picked out of a smoke-filled room, as you said earlier, that the primary election doesn't really matter from a Pennsylvania perspective. So let's just, I'm not saying we should go that way or not. I'm saying that taking a look at it would be valuable, especially as things have changed since the 1930s when our election code was written. So let's see about how those states are doing it. And maybe if we were to remove the committee aspect, we could look at that. The other thing that I thought about is definitely the need to modify the number of ballots that are printed, but possibly looking at how many states with open primaries do a single ballot and whether or not they use, I want to say ranked choice, but I know we're going to get into a whole nother ball game there, but that's my, I want to go down that road, but let's take baby steps. Right. But if we could just look at what those other states are doing, not just at a top down level, but maybe a little granular to see how they're managing committee elections and see what the options are there, I think that'd be a wise idea.
Well, and I think looking at, like you just said, looking at to see what states use one form for everybody, but then that's going to be one where it doesn't matter what party you are in, you're going to be able to vote in either party's primary. And so again, that's something I think we should look at too.
I think that the thing that is important to keep in mind is that independent voters and nonpartisan voters pay taxes and are represented ultimately in the end by candidates that are elected, whether they're elected on a Republican ballot, a Democratic ballot, or in the ballot in November. Yeah. So inclusion seems to be a smart way to go. It's just in this committee, we're looking at how the best ways to do that.
How to make it happen. Yeah, no. And that's part of why we're bringing this here now. We're not expecting a decision or anything else. We just need to know what our homework needs to be and get a feel for where you all are on the issue. Anybody else have something to offer?
Well, I hate to disagree with Christina because she's such a nice person and we've always had nice conversations, but this whole conversation makes no sense to me. I mean, if I'm on two baseball teams and Russ, your team is picking a captain and my team's picking a captain, my team members aren't coming over to pick your captain. It doesn't work that way. So it makes absolutely no sense. So, it's the party nomination, whether you like it or not. You said, you can switch parties temporarily to make that happen if you're really adamant about having a say in who that party's nominee is, which I think, that's kind of even risky, but you can do it legally. It's there.
Independent can also register.
Absolutely.
As a party to
but
vote.
to Russ's point, I mean, let's have the conversation then about how independent candidates get on the ballot, because that's completely unfair, totally different circumstances, and totally different way to do it. But let's have that discussion as well. But, you know, no one outside of the registered members of that party should have the right to vote on it. That's just how it is. And I get the fact that they're paying for it. I've talked about that many times, and I know probably members of my party will disown me, but then let them pay for the primary. I don't care. They got the money. And quite frankly, they should be coughing up some dough, because it is for their nominees. And if they don't like that, then go back to the smoke-filled rooms, as Russ likes to call it. I'm going to tell you right now, I've never run for statewide candidacy. Russ, you have, but you don't campaign any harder than you do to gain your nominee at your party's nomination. That's a hard way to campaign, and it's probably a lot more difficult in many respects than campaigning door to door and doing it to the public. So, you know, for somebody to say you don't have to campaign in order to get your party's nomination, if it were done that way behind smoke-filled doors, I would totally argue that that's not accurate at all. So, you know, just pick one way or the other, but it makes absolutely no sense to me to even consider allowing somebody who's non-affiliated or independent to vote in a Republican or Democrat primary, or you know, for any of the other parties for that matter.
I think a thread to what underlying what prior speakers have said is kind of a freedom of association, as in we're private parties. We have a right to determine how internally we choose to do this, and only our members should allow to do it. I'm familiar with a 1960, I believe, Pennsylvania Supreme Court case that actually holds that because the political parties have the taxpayers pay for these primaries, which are procedures that are making decisions for their associations, that therefore those associations have given up some of their rights to determine their internal processes. I came across it in a legal battle regarding whether or not a county committee who was disciplining its members had to give those members due process rights, as in, do you have to allow them to cross-examine witnesses and things like that? So I believe in what the prior speakers have said regarding closed primaries. I don't like the concept of someone who's not a voluntary member of my party choosing its leaders. However, and this might be for the staff attorneys to look at, what if any legal implication exists because of that ruling that says, if you're going to have the government pay for your primaries, then you don't get to choose all the rules anymore. We have a right to, as the government, to install certain concepts of fairness, you know, whatever you want to do. So I agree with the prior speakers, but perhaps you could see if that is going to play anything on this open primary.
If you
issue.
have a citation for that, please send it to me. I can go find it. I'm pretty good at structuring searches, but it would save me a lot of time.
It
if
shall
you
be
could
done, my
send me.
lord.
I like this guy. Anybody else? Oh,
Just-
Ricky.
Yeah, sure. Ricky Santee. Just real quick, one of the arguments I've heard, and that comes up from time to time, Northampton County is a home rule charter, so I have to deal with referenda on a regular basis. I have 3 that's coming in November, which gives me such joy. I just can't wait for the long lines when only 10 people show up because they're reading them. But I digress. That's one of the issues in the primary, that these local had a spate of library tax referenda, 3 in a row. One was in a primary, was a off-year primary. The independent voters have a right, but to Representative Diamond's point, I had a third ballot style, which was just a question for independent voters. One of the arguments I've heard, I don't pretend to know much about it, but because we have referenda initiatives, constitutional amendments, that if it's closed, but voters who are independent or unaffiliated, I would like the staff to explore that, what impact the close would have on a referenda such as that. Whether those states have any, if they do have closed, do any states have requirements that referenda or initiatives go in a general, for those states that do, knowing that some don't.
Did you get that? Okay. Pat?
I was concerned I missed this portion of the debate, but I knew that if I had, that Representative Diamond would be staunchly in support this particular change is that some in the legislature have been considering. The good news is that I think this body will be wrestling with this question for a while. I don't think we're going to settle on anything anytime soon. I guess just one point and confession, because I've gotten into a little bit of a habit of making confessions in this space. I have forgotten twice to toggle my registration back to a major party to participate in a primary election, because I've been in a habit of toggling it back and forth. One of those reasons being that, given my day job, I think being an unaffiliated voter says a little bit more, in addition to just not making political contributions. But I've forgotten twice to do that. I was too busy getting ready for the next election, which, that is my fault, but I've made that mistake. Incidentally, the other confession I've made in this body is it's because it's still relevant to one of the issues we have to finish up. Is I told my wife that I was going to take her ballot to the city hall to the drop box, because I was thinking like a regular person and not an election nerd. So I'll have to think about what my next confession is at the next meeting. But those are my two for the record at the moment.
The police will be right over.
Yeah, right. Take me away. It's completely true. Like we solved for the problem of the prior century, where this stuff was discussed in closed rooms and the public had no say. That problem's been addressed. I think, like, philosophically, what's worth considering, again, not right now, but in the months or years to come, and other states are wrestling with this, is that primary elections that allow partisan voters an open say on their nominees, whether or not there's another and broader shift that has to be considered about primary elections, more about vetting and filtering candidates for a final kind of selection. I mean, when I describe how elections work to like high school students, for example, I say the primaries are like the playoffs for the two major parties, and the winners compete in the final. But that's worked. I think that's worked pretty well for a long time. But what has changed over the past 30, 40 years at least, is that there's usually not much of a final, right? There's certainly not in the city of Philadelphia, and there aren't in many places of the state, where the general election isn't really an election. There are no choices. So, I think the status quo, certainly has some issues with it. Now, exactly what the solution is, I think that's a much harder question. Is it just like independents being able to choose a partisan ballot? Is it nonpartisan top 2, top 4 RCV? And there's also like this consideration of, are we trying to include the entire electorate as an objective versus when we have an election and make a choice, do we have a system that gives us the best opportunity to have a winner that most of the electorate supported, which, when we have a closed primary, first past the post system, you tend to end up from time to time with folks who the fuller electorate, everybody who's a registered voter may not have been too as keen on, even if we had high rates of participation. And this is where I think Pennsylvania will have a long time to figure this out, because there are only a few states with these other systems, and it'll be helpful to us to see these other cities and states experiment with these systems and see how they perform over time, because they're still pretty new. California's and Washington's nonpartisan top 2s are new. Alaska has the most, I guess, radical or in the vanguard system with a nonpartisan top 4 primary and then an RCV general. And then there are a few other scattered jurisdictions that have other variations of those. But I think as a country, like, this is a pretty, early and immature kind of discussion about.
When you say RCV, do you mean ranked choice voting?
Ranked choice voting.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And of course, Alaska is kind of like in a league of its own in a way. But I think the reason they made that change was pretty similar as to why these sorts of changes are being considered in other states, because the electorate really is not just polarized but segregated, right? I mean, Pennsylvania's voter reg numbers are pretty balanced between the two major parties, but it's not a purple state. It's Democrats live close to Democrats and Republicans close to Republicans. Am I out of time?
It's a T.
It's
Allegheny, Philadelphia, and the rest of us.
right. I'm certainly not going to use that James Carville reference if that's what you wanted me to say next. I'm definitely not saying that, Russ. Definitely not saying that.
It's James Carville. I just think it's a good way to describe it.
But the thing is, other states got the same deal, right? For any number of reasons, demographic changes, economic changes that have happened. and it's a different state. Communities are different. And like, again, in Philly, there are more than 7 Democrats for every 1 Republican. There just isn't a general election. And then more recently, we're having we're reflecting, I guess, on the way we set our charter up, in the mid 20th century, where, we were going to have, the major party gets most of the most representation, and the minority party that for most of that 70 years, the Republicans get those 2 other seats. We're not sure if that system's working the way it's supposed to anymore, right? With other partisan entities or parties, in a way, being able to capture those seats and maybe not having the ideological reflectiveness on our council that the charter founders contemplated. So I offer all that up, and that I think this should be a long discussion, and I don't think we should contemplate big changes unless we've thought through every last element, both kind of philosophically what the outcome needs to be, all the administrative stuff. I mean, the independents choosing one ballot or the other as a policy question is simpler, but there are administrative implications of it. So I think that's where this board will have plenty to chew on for a while.
And I don't think we're not necessarily seeing it as an urgent topic that we have to hop right on, but it is one of the topics that was identified at the beginning as something we wanted to look at. So, we will do our homework. We will pull information together. If we had come up with a proposal in 2 years, then that's when we come up with a proposal. This board doesn't die. We might, but the board doesn't. So, and that's something we've experienced at Joint State over the 80+ years, is sometimes you can propose something and it can take 5 or 10 years until it happens. And you just have to take the long view and go with the flow. So that's what we will do with the primary question.
If I could just add on the administrative side of this, I mean, it should be noted that there is only one reason that the Commonwealth even registers your party affiliation. There's only one interest in doing that, and that's to determine which primary you get to vote in. There is nothing else that is ever done officially with that information. So administratively,
Solicit money.
no, the state's not doing that. The county's not doing that. Political candidates are certainly doing that.
Yes.
That's right. So, keep that in mind too. Because we have closed primaries, it's the only reason the Commonwealth even registers your party affiliation. I mean, you just keep that in mind as you're thinking about, well, how open do we actually want to make this in? Because if we're going totally open, like California and Washington, you don't even, the state can just scrub everybody's voter affiliation because it just doesn't matter anymore. But it's one less field of data that won't get messed up. It's one less field of data that, a keystroke doesn't have to be made at the county level or the state level or by the people registering to vote. So it is always amusing to me when I think about that, when, we have this argument over independents versus Republicans. There's only one reason we even keep track of that information in Pennsylvania, and that is to determine which primary election you could vote for. There's other people who use it for other reasons, but that's just like an add-on, and it's not a state function. It's not a Commonwealth interest. The only Commonwealth interest is to determine which primary election you can vote in.
Well, an evolution way down the road, rolling out of this, would be talking about ranked choice voting, which is another topic that was brought up now I suspect you guys can debate that one for a long time, but it's also something that we ultimately see sitting down and talking within this body about, and more long-term, however. So anybody else want to offer anything right now on the open primaries? We're going to do some homework and do some research and bring that information back to you.
I just had a wonky little nugget of knowledge. North Dakota doesn't have voter registration at all. Like they just don't even register, which kind of made me think like when we were talking about data and how much that I guess their partisan affiliates don't have anything to buy. They don't have any lists to buy. So I just thought that was an interesting topic. And as we're getting close to the end, I was wondering if anybody wanted to kind of dig into Ricky's earlier comment about changing the electioneering code from 10 feet to 100 feet. And maybe if we are able today to kind of come together and say, hey, that's something we want to push ahead to the assembly to kind of just do a memorandum that would do the same thing. I think that, I don't know if that's something that we could just kind of hash out for 10 minutes or so.
I'm fine with that. Having that conversation, basically the do not disturb distance. And there are many aspects of it, including the definition of where's the line? Where I vote is in a church and there's a vestibule. And when the weather's cold, the candidate people will be in that vestibule and you have to go through that vestibule to get to the voting place. And how close is that to the doors to the polling place versus whatever place is the other marker. But man, I get really articulate after lunch. But the point is there are various aspects of that we need to define beyond making that space wider, but that space from what to what.
Yeah, I just would like to offer an alternative suggestion to like, rather than jumping into the, let's move it from X to Y. Part of it is what you're saying, like defining, what those points are would be important, but then also taking a look at what are other states doing? How are other states approaching this? Because we're not obviously the only state in the country that has to deal with it. I'm thinking about in terms of both more urban polling locations when you're talking about, okay, well, you have to be 100 feet away. And what does that actually mean on a practical basis? If you're 100 feet away from something, where does that actually put someone like physically? And then the other would be like in more rural locations where, you're at a township building and there may not be 100 feet worth of parking. So, it's just trying to understand like what those different things look like based on the demographics of the state would probably be important.
And that's a really good point. And we try to do that generally, is to try. We don't want to reinvent the wheel if we don't have to. And we're perfectly happy to plagiarize from other states. So yeah, we can definitely take a look at that. Jesse.
Not to add things to your list, but I mean, what we're literally talking about here is restricting highly protected First Amendment speech. I mean, political speech is the most protected speech out there. I would want to also get an idea of what legally are we allowed to do? I mean, I know, for example, when it comes to protesters who are protesting, for example, abortion clinics, there are sanctioned and allowable distances you can keep them away. But I think the courts have in the past wrestled with over what are the concerns, how far is too far, to the point where you're now restricting somebody's ability to exercise their First Amendment rights. So it's not only just a practical standpoint. I'd be interested to hear maybe from staff on the legal issue part of it as well.
Yvonne, a new guy question.
Yeah.
We tackle issues like this. Do we go back and look at the legislative history of why 10 feet was established to begin with?
If I can find it, we
Just
look
to
at
see
it.
whether those
Yep.
reasons
This
still
is-
apply, or
I'll put a little plug in for my frustration with the way our legislative records are being maintained, especially the older ones. When I want to look at a legislative journal to read the comments of the person who proposed the statute, and that's before 1990. I don't even, if we even have them anymore, I may have to go over to State Law Library or up here to get that bound volume. And our Statutory Construction Act, if it's in our legislative journal, it's relevant to interpreting that statute. So that can get frustrating finding older, earlier stuff. But no, we do that all the time. We did something on the school code one time, and I pulled out legislative history from the 11 original school code, talking about, because the statutes will even if it's been repealed, you can go back, you can look at the purposes, clauses, and things like that, and get a handle for why this was done a particular way. And that is, I am also a huge know your history person. You have to know where it came from before you can take it in another direction and get a feel for what was going on. So yeah, that's one of our things we do. And not everybody here might actually know that, because I don't know that I've stood on my soapbox and communicated it before. But no, that legislative history is really important. And we try to look at that. Why did you do that? I know we looked at it in truancy, and we look at school attendance, and why were certain statutes enacted in the 49 school code. So yes, we will definitely be looking at that, because I can only repeat myself. You got to know what's gone before you can make an intelligent decision about where you're going on anything. And so that's my soapbox
I have
moment
a
on
couple
that.
comments on that discussion, but I know Lisa had some too.
Okay.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, I've traveled around the country looking to see how other people are voting, and I've seen firsthand the differences between 10 feet, 50 feet, and there are pros and cons, obviously, to all that. So when the staff is looking at this, if they could, especially if they're going to look at other states, maybe to see how they got to where they are, and how did we get to 10 feet? And if there are a list of things in the code that would conflict, because sometimes we change one thing and then it conflicts with some other thing. So keeping in mind, obviously, First Amendment rights and all that.
And that is one of my personal little bet noirs about a 1937 election law that's been amended repeatedly and inconsistently. And we're still dealing with that when we're talking about things like the provisional ballots and reading stuff together. So one of our charges that we've kind of not paid a lot of attention to thus far, because we've really been trying to deal with hot issues, is, and it's the first thing listed in our charge, is clean up this 1937 statute and get that language under control, get it modern, get it plain language, clean up that archaic 1930s grammar where you've run on sentences and 20,000 clauses. And really, from the perspective of cleaning it up, not changing it, just making it into a format that's readable in the 21st century. And then we can come back at it and say, okay, this is here. And one of the things I'm planning on doing with our staff is tearing it apart into all those articles and chapters and organizing that puzzle and putting it together and finding all of those conflicting provisions and all of those overlapping kind of things. It might end up being my retirement party, but who was I talking to earlier? Leo. I said after that I was going to do the school code. So, figure I got a good 10 years left. Oh, that's another one that drives me crazy. I mean, there's a statute in there, not that we're enforcing it, but there's a line in the school code about the school district. If the kid lives more than like 2 miles walking distance from the school, you have to put him up overnight. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. That might have been relevant when my dad went to school. So, but there's just all of that kind of stuff going on. And that is, I will not get off on the why we need an office of codifier in Pennsylvania to make sure all our statutes are consistent and reflect what each other's saying, so they're not stomping all over each other. We're the only state in the country that does not have a central law code, that has our pamphlet laws flopping around all over here with no order other than the year they were enacted in. And then you have the unofficial compilations of Westlaw and Purdon's. But your official statutory law is in pamphlet laws by year. That's crazy. So that's, like I said, another soapbox I can get off on. But yes, we will
Yvonne,
look at that.
Can I make two quick comments on
Sure, Joe.
what we were discussing there with the distance?
Shut up, Yvonne. Let me
No, no. Maybe, I don't know. No, the 100 feet, in some precincts, that would put people in a cornfield. So great comments about that, Leo. And this is purely a personal request and probably is a First Amendment issue. So I'm just throwing it out there. I'll let the lawyers figure it out. But if we could outlaw political signs at the same time, that'd be great.
Hey, I have a BA in that, Buster. Along with economics, I combine them.
And one thing too, I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up for just possibly in the future, Yvonne. It's not entirely election related, but it is something that counties are dealing with. And while I have Russ and two representatives from the Senate here, if we don't fix the right to know law, I'm telling you right now, it is getting worse and worse every single day. When you have a staff of 3 people in a commissioner's office and the elections office comes up and says, we just got this right to know request. And this is every department in the county, by the way, but the elections office comes up and says, we just got this right to know request. It's going to take us at least 30 days. We're going to have to go over in the old jail and start sifting through the records. The vexatious requests that are coming through are absolutely insane. And it is driving our people to the point of leaving our offices. And it's got to get wrapped up and get under control, or we're never going to be able to keep anybody in our employment.
I haven't read it, but I know there's at least one piece of legislation amending RTK currently floating around out there. See if I can find it and send it to you, Joe. I don't remember. I honestly don't think I looked at it to see what it was going to do. Sometimes, especially in this job, if you read too many bills, it starts to blur the line between what the law is and what the law might be. And so then you have to stop and go back and look it up and say, oh yeah, no, that's a proposal. That's not actually what's going on. So you nodded there, Leo. You know what I'm talking about. So okay. We have like 4 minutes. We're not going to do anything else. Command decision. Mr. Chairman, would you be okay with that?
Yeah. Do I need a motion to adjourn? I don't. Okay. Can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? So moved. Is there a second? All right.
Everybody,
TGIF.
thank you so much. This was a really good discussion. I think we're coming away with a lot of work to do. And I think this group is really good at working together and talking to each other. So, and